A widow with twins lay half buried in the snow until a stranger's shadow fell across her. In the unforgiving west, where the wind cut like a blade and death waited behind every ridge, a young widow lay in the snow with her newborn twins. Folks thought fate had buried them for good, until a lone cowboy stepped out of the dark, carrying fire's warmth and a vow he never had to speak. From that moment, a town would witness a story of honor, blood, and unshaken resolve. The wind didn't howl that day. It kept score. It ran a cold knife along High Lonesome and left tally marks in the drifts, where the country narrowed to a throat of rock. Down in that pinch of white and granite, a woman lay half buried, a torn coat pulled over two small lives pressed against her ribs. A pair of wagon ruts had wandered to the edge of Cold Creek Draw and simply gone to ground, as if the earth had swallowed them. Blood, thin as ink in water, feathered across the crust and vanished under spindrift. Eli McKenna came off the ridge slow, not because he was lazy, but because a man alone learns to read the world the way a hungry coyote reads wind. He'd been checking a string of half-starved beeves and tying up loose wire where the posts leaned. The sun never broke the lid of clouds. The air had that hammered taste you get when weather turns mean. What he first noticed was the wrong color in the snow. Rust where there should be only shadow. He stepped down and the cold bit through his chaps like teeth. No words? Not then. He dropped to one knee, brushed powder off a cheek gone pale as skim milk, and saw the twitch of a tiny hand near the torn hem. Two mouths moved against the woman's chest, not crying so much as trying to remember how. He slid an arm under her shoulders, found the knot of a pulse fainter than a moth's wing. He wasn't built for speeches, he worked. From his saddlebag he pulled a river stone he'd wrapped in wool at dawn and tucked it between the twins, another against the woman's sternum. He shrugged out of his coat and folded it around the lot of them, then cinched the bundle with a latigo strap, the way you'd hold green firewood together for one last carry. He stood with a grunt that steamed in the air and started for the line camp, boots creaking, snow coming sideways like thrown sand. The country dropped away in shelves. Cornices hung where the wind had shaved them thin. Once his right foot punched through and the world tilted, the whole weight of them slamming his hip. He went down to his elbow and didn't curse, not aloud. He slid his free hand along the cinched strap, felt it holding, and eased his boot back to firm crust. He leaned into the storm and took another step, then another, counting breaths instead of distance. Time lost its edges. The light went the color of old pewter. Somewhere above, a raven flogged the sky and vanished. He could feel heat leaking out of the bundle through his shirt and into the cold, like a promise, being forgotten. He bent his head and talked to his legs without words. The snow squealed under his heels. The drifts hissed at his knees. The wind kept score. The line camp showed itself as a dark seam between two junipers, a shack with a lean-to built meaner than a prayer but truer. Eli shouldered the door with his thigh and let them in with him, shut the weather out with his back, and moved in the narrow light like a man who had done this before and might have to again. He built flame the old way, pine slivers, dry curls, a match struck on his belt buckle, a slow breathing until orange took hold. He set a blackened coffee pot over the first lick of heat and heaped small stones around the edge to warm. He laid the woman on his bunk, the twins tight against her, melted a pan of snow, wet a cloth, and wiped their faces the way he'd once wiped a colt's eyes, careful as if he were washing Sunday china. He wouldn't think of why he knew how. The past was a cold stove. He pulled off her ruined gloves, blew into her fingers till color bled back, then slid a warmed stone to the hollow beneath her scarf. The twins' breath came in feather puffs. One of them, he couldn't tell girl or boy by anything but a guess, rooted at the wool and went still, listening for a heartbeat that had nearly left them. Steam licked the rafters. The coffee pot ticked and shivered as if it too had nerves. Eli hooked the handle with a stick and set the pot to the side, careful not to waste heat. He kept moving because motion was its own kind of prayer. He checked the door latch, looked once through the chink, and saw the snow smoothing his tracks already, the country erasing what it didn't want to remember. He went back to the bunk. The woman's lashes were rhymed, but he saw a flutter and then the hard swallow of a throat that had forgotten spit. He didn't ask for her name. There would be time for that if the world was generous. He pressed the back of his hand to her jaw. Warmth lived there now, small and stubborn. Then the sound in the room changed. It wasn't the wind. It was the awful quiet that falls when a baby stops making any sound at all. The smaller of the two had gone limp at the mouth, eyes open but far away. Eli didn't think, he only reached. He took the hottest stone from the ring, wrapped it quick in a torn piece of his shirt, and pressed it above the tiny heart. Close enough to kiss. He cupped his other palm at the back, breathed once, twice, as if he could blow his own heat through bone and skin into that flicker. The wind scraped a last line across the wall and went on. The coffee pot clicked. The child did not cry. He cupped the warm stone to the tiny chest and leaned close till his own breath fogged the child's lips. A long second passed, then two. He gave a small pat at the back with 2 fingers, a steady rhythm like knocking on a shut door. The mouth twitched. A thread of air caught. A weak cough fluttered against his palm, then another, and the little body answered with a thin, stubborn cry that sounded like a hinge trying to remember how to open. He let the sound fill the room and only then let himself breathe. The mother stirred at the edge of it, a slow break from heavy sleep. Her eyes opened to the color of wet slate, lost at first, then finding the rafters, the stove glow, his face. She tried to speak, and no word came. He tipped a cup at her mouth and let a sip of hot water in, then another. The steam lifted the frost from her lashes. Her hand rose a little, fell, rose again, and found the blanket where both babies lay, wedged like field mice under hay. "Easy," he said, voice low as a boot on plank. He checked the small stone wrap and changed it for a warmer one, traded out the one near her sternum, and rubbed her fingers till feeling returned under his thumb. The camp held a hush you could hear, the tiny clicks in the coffee pot, a wet crack in the stove, the twin breaths counting each other. Snow rasped at the door seam and moved on. Color came back to her face in shallow waves. Her throat worked. She stopped to swallow. The babies. "They're holding," he said. She shut her eyes, and when she opened them, the fear had stepped back a pace. He slid a pan near and shaved a sliver of jerky thin as paper, let it soften in water over the heat, then fed her by the corner of a spoon. Half for her, half for the babies, the way he'd feed a runt calf when you were trying to save the cow, too. A small shake took her, coal leaving by the same door it came. He set a warmed rag along her ribs and pressed his palm there, till the tremor ran out and the bones eased under him. After a while she lifted her head a little. "Name?" he asked, not pushing, not reaching for anything more than the size of a word. "Clara," she said, the sound barely above steam. "Clara May." He nodded once. "Eli." Her gaze fell to the bundle. He drew a corner of wool aside, just enough so she could see both little faces, pink struggling back through pale. Her touch was careful as a moth's wing. "June," she whispered, brushing the one that had cried last, then the other. "And Jessie." Eli set the names inside himself, where a man keeps compass things. He took her boots, heavy with snow turned to ice, and set them by the stove, stuffing wads of dry cloth into the toes, so they'd hold shape while they thawed. He stripped his coat liner and made a better nest on the bunk, rolling spare shirts tight for side bolsters so nobody could roll off by accident. He moved like a quiet river, heat, water, shelter, then the rest. The woman's eyes went to the door. She said nothing, but he followed the look because a person that close to losing things learns to hear what isn't said. He tipped his hat down, stepped to the wall, and peered through the chink between boards. The light outside was flat pewter. The wind had laid a skin on the drifts and was working to erase what day had written. Still, near the junipers, he could make out a scallop of marks where a horse had stood too long, melted the crust, and moved on. Newer than his own, older than the storm. He set the bar in the hasp and returned to the stove. The babies slept between small hunger and small peace. Clara May watched him with a look he'd seen in a mirror once, trying to decide whether to trust the next breath. He poured coffee for himself and only held it, letting the warmth find his cold, bit hands. He offered her a cup of hot water again, and she drank, eyes closing at the first swallow like a prayer that didn't need words. "What happened?" he said at last, and wasn't sure if he meant it as question. If it was, he left the door open for her to leave it unanswered. She took a few breaths before she tried the hill of memory. "Men," she said, "wanted what we had, paper or no paper." Her mouth hardened, then softened at the same time. "They shot my husband where he stood." Her voice failed there, and she didn't chase it. She fixed her eyes on the stove door and listened to it tick. After a while, "They left us like a warning." Eli didn't let the silence turn sharp. He raked one coal with the poker and set another stone nearer the lip to warm. The twins sighed as if answering some old tune. Outside, the wind shifted. Something small hit the wall and slid to the sill. A tuft of juniper needles, or a thought, or the last of a dark. He gathered the spent rags, wrung them, laid them to dry across a line. He fetched a scrap of clean cloth and tied back the woman's hair so the damp wouldn't freeze against her cheek the next time the door opened. It was a small thing, a chore any wife might do for herself on a better morning. It felt like laying a stone in a foundation, one you don't see once the house stands, but you'd miss if it wasn't there. The room had gotten warmer without him noticing. June fisted the edge of wool and worked her thumb free. Jessie made that old man face babies make when sleep sits down beside them. Clara May watched, and some tight rope inside her seemed to slacken. Her lips moved. "Thank you," she said, and it landed in the air like a coin you didn't expect to have again. Eli shook his head once. "You were breathing," he said. "That was enough." He checked the latch again. When his fingers touched the wood, they vibrated with something, not the stove and not the storm. He didn't need to put his eye to the crack to know what it was. The country told a man who listened. A slow scuff in the snow. Leather creaked. A horse blew through its nose right outside the lean-to, close enough for the sound to travel along the wall and into the bones of the bed. Eli set the cup down without a clink and crossed to the door. The horse outside blew again, short and testing, the way a hand might hover over a latch before trying it. He looked once at Clara May, the twins tucked like two coals under her coat, and tipped his chin toward the far corner. She understood. She pulled the blanket higher and slid her boots back from the stove, so their shape wouldn't catch an eye through the chink. He moved like he'd rehearsed it in some other winter. From a nail he took a bundle of rawhide thongs, a handful of bent nails, and 2 old cans rattling with stones. He slipped out the lean-to, closed it with a palm so the latch wouldn't bark, and let the storm swallow him to the knees. The yard was a white sheet with the wind writing on it. He strung the first thong low across the path to the door, tied it to a can hidden in a curl of sage. He laid a shallow trench where a man's next step would fall, dusted it thin with snow, and gave it teeth. Mesquite thorns he'd saved from summer mending, points meaner than any sermon. He was back inside before the room let go of his shape. He drew the bolt halfway, left it looking shut. He slid the Winchester from the pegs and thumbed 2 cartridges down the tube. No more. A man saves noise like he saves money. He took a long breath and let it out the way you do when a horse is keyed up and you want your steadiness to reach him through the rain. Hoof scuff, leather, a voice like gravel held in a glove. Door looks friendly, the voice said. Another voice closer. Take it. The latch lifted a hair and held there, confused by a bolt that wasn't quite what it seemed. A boot came down where boots always come down at a door. The thong sang. The can in the sage rattled sharp and mean. The boot lifted again and dropped 2 inches farther along, right into the trench. There's a kind of scream men keep for pain they didn't earn fair. It came now, high and foolish, and the man went to his knees in the drift, with thorns through leather and into meat. Eli opened the door only as wide as the rifle's barrel. The wind did him the favor of shouldering in first, raising a white veil between faces. The second man reached for iron because that's what habit and pride make you do. Eli's shot was the size of a word said once and said right. The man folded in the snow like a coat falling off a peg. The yard tore loose. A third shadow flanked left, low and quick. A fist thumped the wall near the window, searching for edge. A fourth shape slid along the lean-to, boots whispering against plank. Clara May's hand found the stove's poker, then the short length of stovepipe Eli kept under the bunk for bad weather. She set the poker down and kept the pipe. Buck Reno's breath fogged the window. He pressed an eye to the crack and saw a dark room, a woman, a glow. He smiled and set his palm to the sill to haul himself up. Clara stepped once, no more than that, and swung. The iron made a quiet sound against his ear, the kind you hear in a shop when a blacksmith misses the sweet spot by a thumb's width. Buck's eyes went wide and childlike. He fell backward into the drift and didn't learn anything from it. Another man darted past the door toward the corner, smart enough to keep low, dumber than the country around him. His shoulder hit the set line Eli had thrown there for coyotes years ago and kept for wolves of any kind. It bit. He swore, thrashed, tangled himself deeper like a calf in new wire. Eli didn't shoot. He stepped out and planted a boot on the man's wrist and said nothing. He looked once toward the trees where horses snorted fog and saw the shape holding still among them, hat brim low, watching with the patience of somebody who thinks he's already won. Silas, the patient one called, as if the name were a question and a verdict. The man under Eli's boot froze. Silas Mott. The voice made a small chuckle. You always were good at rope. Eli didn't answer. He hauled the man up by the back of his coat and shoved him toward the door. From the corner of his eye he caught movement. The first fellow, the one in the thorn trench, working himself to a knee with blood on his boot and shame in his jaw. Eli sighted, then let the bead drift off. Mount, he said to Silas. You ride out now. You carry a message. Silas's mouth worked. He looked at the hat brim out by the horses like a dog. Looks at a hand that's fed and hit him both. Eli didn't repeat himself. He just looked. After a breath, Silas found his feet and stumbled to a sorrel with winter hair and climbed aboard with the stiffness of a man who's lost the right to sit a horse easy. What do I tell him? Silas asked, voice rusted. Tell him the snow's not empty, Eli said. Tell him the woman lives and she ain't alone. Silas nodded so hard it looked like prayer and spurred into the drift. The patient hat tilted once, courteous as church, and turned with him. Two more shapes peeled off the trees and went with their shadow of a leader, the storm folding them up the way a mother tucks a blanket. The yard got quiet, except for the man in the trench, who was busy trying to decide whether to pull the thorn or the boot first. Eli helped him make a better choice. Cut the laces, leave the leather, save the foot. The man hobbled 3 steps and then thought better of pride. He left the boot in the snow like a shed snakeskin and limped into the brush, keeping his head down the way a covey does when hawks are out. Eli closed the door. The room seemed smaller now that it held safety again. Clara May set the stovepipe on the hearth as if it were a candle she'd finished with. Her hair had come loose and a strand stuck to her cheek. He took a scrap of cloth and tied it back without asking. She let him. He knelt to roll the thorns back into a rag and saw it lying in the churned snow by the sill. A strip of leather, gone dark with old sweat, dropped when Buck went over. It had a charm hanging from it, a bit of tooth polished by years of worry, and a smear of something that wasn't dye. When he touched it, his fingers came away tacky and sweet-pitched. Pine tar hardened to a black shine. Someone had pressed a brand into it while the stuff was hot. A crude triangle framed in fire lines, the mark a man might wear if he wanted fear to do his talking. He wiped his fingers on the rag and set the strip on the table. The babies breathed like tiny bellows. The coffee pot ticked once, then twice. Outside, the wind changed its mind and ran the other way, erasing names. Eli looked at the mark and knew the storm that mattered hadn't blown through yet. Morning should have looked kinder after a night survived, but the sky came up the color of old zinc and kept its distance. Eli set a pan to melt fresh snow and poured ground straight into the pot, the way men do when there's no time for manners. Clara May fed June and Jessie by turns, propping them in the crook of her coat like 2 sparrows blinking at a hard world. The strip of leather with the blackened pine tar mark lay on the table between the tin cups, a dark thought that wouldn't leave. Hoofbeats came honest this time, not sneaking, and the door filled with a tall man dusted white from the hat brim down. A star rode his vest, dulled by weather, not by pride. "Ben Doolin," Eli said. "Eli." The sheriff took the room in with one sweep, then let his eyes rest on the babies, then the woman, then the strip of leather. He didn't touch it. "Where'd you pick that up?" "Off a fella with a soft head," Eli said. Doolin's jaw set. "Pine Brand Brotherhood, that tar's their hymn. They been drifting north with a preacher who trims scripture to fit his rope." Gideon Goss, Clara's hands tightened. Not much, just enough to show the truth had landed. Doolin saw it and pitched his voice gentle as he knew how. "I can walk you to Dry Creek, put you under a roof with 4 walls and neighbors who still remember Sunday." Eli glanced at the window. The storm had dressed the tracks again. The ridge held its breath. He shook his head once. "Walls won't hold a man like Goss. Water and wind will." Doolin didn't argue. He'd buried men who argued with weather. "Then move," he said. "This shack's a lit match in a hay barn." He slid a small packet from his pocket, powdered willow bark wrapped in newsprint, and set it near Clara's elbow. "For fever," he said, and left without finishing the coffee he hadn't taken. By noon, the camp looked like a room a man had never lived in. Eli rolled blankets tight, stowed the stones, still warm, in a tow sack, tied the pot outside the saddle to clatter, where a clatter might sound like 2 men instead of 1. Clara wrapped each child in a scarf. Tia Soledad would have nodded at, if she'd been there, snug and low, faces free to find air, ears covered from the knife-edge wind. Eli cut their names into a fresh tag and nailed it to the bunk post the way you might mark a tree to find later, though some places you don't get back to whatever you write. They left high lonesome under a sky that hadn't decided if it wanted to snow again or go to sleep. Ash Creek showed itself as a dark ribbon of ice, with water muttering under it, shouldered by sage and juniper that wore their own frost. Eli kept the horses on the lee side, hooves careful on the crust, eyes running ahead for color that didn't belong. The twins slept as only the newly spared can, Mouths open, breath small but true. Smoke announced itself in a thin line off to the south, not the fat plumes that mean hearths and stew pots, but a hungry needle. They topped a low rise and found a windmill sprawled like a broken spider, vanes twisted back, tower charred where someone had soaked it with oil and set a match. A stock tank beside it steamed faint and foul. Eli dipped a glove, sniffed. "Kerosene?" he said. He didn't say the rest. Men who poison water don't care about cattle or children or the season that follows. Clara held the twins closer and studied the ground the way a person reads a bad letter. Not far off, a line shack like Eli's had been open to the weather. The door stood at an angle, a hinge never intended. Inside, the bunk was gutted and black, but the wall above it carried a small mercy, the shape of a cross left clean where a picture had hung till the heat licked it free. Someone before them had kept a face close. Someone had taken it away or watched it burn. They didn't linger. Wind ran its fingers through the grass and found dry. Somewhere behind them a spark took. Eli knew the sound before the smell reached them, the whisper that turns to a hiss that turns to a lesson. "Fire," he said, and didn't waste the breath on anything else. He drove the horses down into the shallow of the creek where ice had thinned. The water there ran cold and honest. He soaked a blanket and threw it across Clara's shoulders, then another over the twins, then one on himself. Smoke came low, a gray hand searching for throat. Flames licked the sage tops and ran, tripping where the ice held them up. They moved in a world gone small, water underfoot, smoke above, heat crawling at their backs. Eli cut a narrow line with his spade where last summer's flood had left a seam of bare sand. Fire reached it, tasted it, and went looking for someone else to chew. When they climbed out the far side, Clara's lashes were wet and clumped, but her gaze was level. She turned once to watch the strip of black the fire had left like bad handwriting across the flats. June coughed and settled. Jessie frowned the way old men do when weather works on their bones. Eli wrung the blankets and set them steaming on the saddle horn to stiffen in the cold, then slung them back wet as armor. They went on. By the time the day bent its knee, the sky had bled, down to the color of a bruise you got long ago and forgot who gave it to you. Mesquite thinned. Rock showed. They found a shallow draw with a lip that would turn wind and a shelf of stone that would hold heat. Eli set a small fire low and mean, pinned with rocks so it wouldn't talk. The coffee pot did its little dance again, faithful as any old dog. Clara cupped the twins to the warmth, one at a time, letting steam shine their cheeks. Eli lifted a harmonica out of his vest pocket, dented, out of tune in places like a life, and breathed a tune through it that didn't ask for attention and didn't mind if it got some. They ate what could be eaten without a plate. Clara stitched a loose heel on one tiny sock, with thread she pulled from the hem of her own sleeve. She didn't speak the grief that sat by her shoulder and refused to leave. She set her needle and made a straight line and let that stand for what words stumble over. When the fire had settled to red eyes and the creek had gone back to muttering its old prayer, Eli rose and walked the perimeter twice, then a third time because some nights require it. On the way back he saw it, not big, not loud, but clear, a smear on the bark of a cottonwood just at shoulder height, black and glossy in the firelight's reach. He touched it and his finger came away tacky, with the sugar-bitter reek of pitch. The smear curved once and dropped in a line like handwriting. "We see you." He wiped his hand clean on the ground and didn't say a thing. He kicked a little dirt over the last bright of the fire and went to sit beside the woman and the children who were not his and were all the same, while the wind made new tallies on a country wide enough to hold trouble and mercy at once. Dawn came thin and windless, the kind of quiet that lays a hand over a mouth. The country lifted into stone, mesquite giving way to jackrock and shale, and then the land pinched down to a slit where two walls leaned close enough to share breath. Folks called it Needle Pass because a man with sense wouldn't thread it unless he had to. Today, they had to. Eli walked the seam first, counting by boots, reading the slope where frost turned loose. Scree waited on the high lip like grain in a hopper. He built a poor man's gate out of what the ridge offered, a dead man anchor sunk under a ledge, a rawhide cross-tie threaded through a cleft, a single knot you could pull from below when the hour arrived. He stacked fist stones, loose layered sand, and pea rock over them, and chinked the edge with shale so it would look like the hill had always meant to fall that way. Clara May settled the twins inside her coat and tied a scarf low across her back to keep June snug, and set Jessie high where she could feel his rise and fall. She said nothing. She watched Eli's hands and learned the plan the way people do when words would only make it smaller. He showed her the rope he had thrown from one shelf of rock to the other, a drab line crossing a narrow sky. She tested it. It sang in her glove. They waited in the shade with the sun still thinking about its work. Dust lifted to the south in a slow rolling thumbprint. 5 riders, then 6, then the one in front riding loose and amused, hat brimmed down like a man peering from his own porch. Harlan Voss, he had the look of someone who believes the world will step aside if he leans hard enough. He eased his horse into the throat of the pass and let the sound of iron on stone go ahead like a calling card. His boys spread out as much as the rock allowed and started to grin at how tight the country had made everything. Voss raised 2 fingers without hurry. The men drew reins. He turned his head a notch as if he could see through stone. Maybe he could see the shape of a man built of old weather and bad luck. Eli didn't answer the invitation in that tilt. He lifted his hand to the rawhide and gave it the smallest kind of pull a man can make. The knot let go like it had been waiting all winter. Scree took a slow breath, sighed, and then dropped with a hiss that turned to a roar. Pea rock ran like water, fist stones bounced and multiplied. A horse reared and lost hind feet. Another tried to side hill and kicked nothing but air. The pass filled with moving ground. Sound went big. Men swore the way boys swear when a lesson finally arrives. Clara stepped into her own portion of the plan. She clipped the rope to her belt and leaned, body flat against stone, feet skittering for purchase as she crossed the narrow. She went hand over hand with June, and Jessie braced in her. A bullet smacked a slab near her hip and spat dust into her teeth. She didn't speed up. She didn't slow down. The line hummed, and then she was on. The far ledge, pulling herself to the shelf where juniper roots made good handholds. She tied off and threw the tail back to Eli. Voss got clear of the first rush by bailing off and dragging his horse by the cheek strap to a pocket where the fall thinned. He found his feet with a kind of grace a bad man sometimes owns. He brought up a Spencer like he'd rehearsed this, thumbed the hammer, and drew a bead on movement in shade. Eli's rifle cracked once and the Spencer rang off the rock, a bell hit with the wrong hymn. Voss jerked half a step, puzzled that his shoulder didn't answer the hand. He grinned anyway, a man who has learned to love his own pose. Eli shot him again, lower, honest as a fence post. The grin left like a guest who'd overstayed. Voss sat, then folded in the dust with his hat still on, and the country took back the noise it had lent him. Dutch Krieg, a raw-boned rider with a muley jaw and ears too big for his hat, saw the pass turn against him and chose the only smart thing he'd ever choose. He slashed loose a saddlebag to shed weight, kicked free of the stirrup caught on a snag, and drove his pony out the way he'd come, face pale under grit. Something clapped from the dropped bag as it split on a rock. Oilskin around a stack of hand-inked pages, lines tight as fence wire, verses bent like nails and hammered into new shapes. preacher Gideon Goss speaking in someone else's voice. The dust settled by degrees, like a room after a fight where the chairs remember their names slowly. A rider, still breathing, clawed up out of the shale and limped away, both hands high with the rifle held by the barrel, as if he'd forgotten what end taught lessons. Eli let him go. He pulled the rope and came across by feel, boots knocking pebbles free, the pass humming under him as if it had a tune of its own. On the far side, they made a small camp the size of a hand. Clara put a lid from the coffee pot to the coals and warmed it till it ticked. She touched it to June's lip, then Jessie's, not for drink, there wasn't any to spare for ceremony, but to tell their small bodies that heat still had a place with them. Eli sat with the pages on his thigh and didn't open them. He had learned what he needed for the day, that men with a brand and a borrowed scripture were gathering, and that a narrow country can be taught to stand up for those who mean to stay. He rose to kick dirt over the last orange and looked south. On a ridge 2 miles off, a twist of smoke climbed in a single black ribbon, not campfire, not cook stove. Signal made by men who want news to travel farther than legs. It coiled once, twice like a warning written in the sky. "Time to move," he said. Clara gathered the twins, and the 4 of them stepped back into a land that never promised much, and sometimes gave it anyway. The country let go of its knives where the rock broke and steam rose from the earth, like an animal breathing. Adobe Springs sat in a crease of pines and red dirt, pools shining under a skin of morning, the air warm enough to make a body doubt the last few days. Eli led them in slow, hat back, 1 palm up, because a place that keeps heat in winter learns to keep other things too. She came out of the steam like someone the ground had made, and then decided to share. Small, copper as a kettle, hair braided neat as fence wire. "Soledad," Eli said. She tipped her chin as if they'd met once in trouble, and decided to be friends again. Her eyes found the bundle in Clara's arms, then the woman carrying it. "Come," she said. The word was soft, but it had a backbone. The spring house was a low dome of rock and juniper poles. Inside, heat held like a promise kept. Soledad set kettles to fussing and shook leaves and bark into a bowl. Yerba buena, willow, a pinch of something that smelled like sun on sage. She laid clean cloths on a flat stone and warmed them with a hand the size of a sparrow. She didn't waste speech. She unwound the twins and lowered them to the shallows until their fists opened and their faces went from pinched to surprised, then to something like joy. Their feet kicked water like they were telling it hello. Clara stood there with her hands still in the shape of holding. Soledad took one, turned it palm up, and brushed a thumb across the raw places where rope and winter had chewed. "Mija," she said, not as pity but as fact. She worked a salve into the skin, the smell of pine pitch and fat and a flower Clara didn't have a name for. She wrapped each hand with a strip of muslin and tied a knot a mother might tie. Eli stripped to the waist and sat, while Soledad cleaned the splinters and small cuts. A man stops noticing when the work won't let him. She threaded horsehair through a bone needle and drew 3 neat stitches where Rock had signed his shoulder. He didn't flinch, but when she pressed a hot cloth there, he shut his eyes like a door closing on weather. "Drink," Soledad said and held a cup to Clara. The tea tasted bitter and right, like hard counsel. Warmth lapped her ribs. Her knees remembered they were knees and not planks. She sank to a stool, pulled June against her shirt, and watched Jesse fall asleep with his mouth open in a perfect O. By afternoon, the steam had written new lines on the room's rafters. Eli mended a cinch with quiet hands. Soledad moved through small tasks that felt like rites, laying cloths along tiny spines, trimming a thread at the hem of a shirt Clara hadn't known could be saved, tucking a warm stone in a towel and setting it near the baby's feet. When she did speak, it came like a low bell. Remember forward, she said, looking at Clara, then at the twins. You carry yesterday so it doesn't spill, but you pour it into tomorrow, see? Clara let the words find a shelf inside. She thought of a house that hadn't been built and the sound of a coffee pot no one had set yet. She thought of a man's coat around, the whole of them, and the rope of breath that had tied 4 lives together in a white ravine. She nodded once. Near dusk, a boy came to the springhouse mouth and waited, the way wild things wait, half in, half gone. Hair cut jagged with a knife, eyes the color of wet bark, shirt too thin for any season. He had a string of bone beads at his throat and the careful stance of someone who had learned to take up little space. Soledad held out a hand without turning. Ven, niño. He slid inside, light on his feet, and stared hard at June until June stared back and made a gurgle like a creek in April. Lost from the cedar country, Soledad said. Men hunted where they should have prayed. She set bread and a heel of cheese in the boy's palm, and he ate as if he feared a sound would make it disappear. Clara lifted Jessie and, with the automatic foolishness of mothers, offered the boy the smell of a baby's hair. He leaned in and breathed as if breath had weight, and he needed some. When Jessie sneezed, he laughed once. A small bark, surprised to hear it, came from him. They bedded on pallets near the warmest wall. Eli set his coat under Clara's head and hung their wet boots in a row above the stones so the leather would hold its shape. The coffee pot sat on a flat rock just off the flame, ticking now and then like a cricket. Outside, pines combed the dark. Inside, the room kept time with 4 small lungs and one man's slower measure. Soledad kept watch the way old women do, eyes not closing all the way. In the middle of the night, when a kettle hissed too eager, she lifted it off and blew across the lip. "Preacher Goss," she said into the steam, so low the word almost didn't make it to the air. "Cedar Basin. He gathers men who like to be told where to point their hate." Eli rolled to an elbow. "You sure?" "Smoke that climbs straight and no wind. Fires in a ring. The coyotes have stayed away." She gave him a look he understood. There are circles that feed and circles that take. "You go see," she said, and it wasn't a question. He rose before dawn, quiet as a thought. He set his hat by the door, checked the rifle's lip and the knife's ride on his belt, and poured the last of last night's coffee into his mouth, like medicine. Clara woke to the sound a boot makes when leather kisses leather. The second strap pulled home. She didn't ask him to stay. She pulled the blanket up over June and Jessie and nodded once, the same way he'd nodded when she'd said the babies' names. He touched 2 fingers to the brim, then to the wood near their heads, the way a man marks a place twice in case the world gets slippery. When the door closed, the room held its heat, but it felt colder all the same. Morning lifted slow, a gray hand across the hill. The boy with the bone beads curled like a pup at the foot of the pallet. Soledad stirred ash and found red underneath, as she always did. "Comer," she said, and broke a tortilla and dipped it in broth and fed Clara as if Clara were her own. The day grew its bones. Steam walked in columns. The pines kept their secrets. Noon came and turned, and shadows lengthened like a herd stringing out for water. Soledad lit copal and let the smoke curl, a clean scent to run off whatever wanted in. The twins slept the long, heavy sleep of the rescued, fists soft, mouths wet. Clara watched the door and pretended she wasn't. Dusk set its elbows on the sill. The steam painted the last light the color of old gold. A coyote called twice and shut up, like he'd remembered his manners. Soledad set another stone to warm and laid it against Clara's feet. "He knows the country," she said. Clara held June closer and let Jessie's breath wash her wrist. "I know," she answered, though the word felt like a thread she'd pulled too hard. Night came proper and sat. The coffee pot ticked once, then didn't. Somewhere far out, a muffled thud rode the air, too far to call a shot, too near to be only rock. They waited until waiting filled the room to the rafters. The boy at the pallet mouth slept with his hand on the bone beads. Soledad's eyes stayed open and kind. Dawn put one pale finger through the cracks of the door, and then the full hand. Birds tried a note and thought better. Eli did not step through. Soledad didn't argue when Clara stood and laced her boots. The old woman only set a small blade in Clara's palm, a knife shaped from bleached bone, haft wrapped tight with sinew and a strip of faded red cloth. It weighed near nothing. It carried weight all the same. "Find the wind, not the trail," Soledad said, tying Clara's scarf low to keep her breath from ghosting. The boy with the bone beads woke long enough to hand over a gourd canteen, then curled back to the warm rock like a pup. June sighed. Jessie smacked a sleepy lip. Clara pressed her mouth to each forehead and let the kisses be the whole speech. She moved out at first light, keeping to the shadow where pinion-stitched lace across the ground. Snow had crusted and then thought better of it. Her boots wrote small, spare sentences no far eye could read. Eli had left the way a man leaves a room he plans to return to, quiet, with nothing tipped over. She read his passing in a scuff on stone, in a tuft of hair snagged on a low branch, in a stamp where a horse had decided what it thought about a narrow place and gone anyway. By mid-morning the country changed tone. Sage gave way to cottonwoods, their winter bones varnished with sun. A smell rode the wind that wasn't altogether from this day, the kind of iron and rot you get when men make mistakes and the land keeps them honest. She slowed, knees bent, the bone knife tucked flat along her wrist until her hand became part blade. Voices came thin through the trees, men talking, not because they had something to say, but because silence makes some fellas nervous. She lay behind a blowdown and looked through its tangle. Eli stood tied to a cottonwood with both hands high and blood dried along his jaw. Hat gone, shirt stuck to a shoulder stitched yesterday and taken to task again. Dutch Krieg had his muley face turned toward nothing, whittling a stick and grinning at the wrong place on the knife. Silas Mott worked a knot that wasn't there and kept glancing at Eli's boots like a thief, studying church windows. A third one leaned on a long rifle, the sort of grin on him that grows when nothing ever told it no. Clara breathed once and shrugged off fear like a shawl too hot to wear. She tracked the wind with her cheek, found the wash where it ran low, and slid there on her side until the earth put her behind the short one with the long grin. When she rose, it was with the plainness of someone setting bread on a table. The bone knife went in sideways under the ear, and the breath left him with surprise, not drama. She caught his weight at the belt so the ground wouldn't learn anything. Silas heard the small sound anyway and half turned, eyes finding a shape that shouldn't be there. He reached, and Clara threw the knife. Not a pretty throw, only close and quick. It missed his neck and cut the strap on his shoulder, so his pistol fell useless into mud and snow. He grabbed for it. Eli made his move. A man doesn't forget his legs, just because his hands are roped. He drove his foot into the split rail propped against the tree, snapped it, and swung the broken length into Silas's shin. Silas sat down hard with a noise like a calf that's lost the gait. Dutch Krieg came up cussing and brought his whittling knife as if a toy had found war. Clara met him with the butt of her empty scabbard and cracked him across the mouth, then the ear. He ran on stubborn, which is another way of being dumb. Eli shouldered into him, turned, and they went down together. Dutch came up gasping and came up again to a fist, and then the fight left him because sometimes men remember they're tired. Clara cut Eli free with a shard of bottle she found half buried in the roots. Glass sharp as gossip. The rope gave with a sound like old timber in a slow fire. Eli sagged and caught himself on a knee, spit blood into dead leaves, and looked at her as if they were supposed to meet here all along. She pressed the gourd to his mouth, and watched his throat take the water like it had missed it for a year. "Can you walk?" she said, and the words were gravel, not doubt. He rose without answering and went to the grinning man who no longer grinned. They put him in the ground under a skin of leaves and snow because air carries more than scent, and Soledad had taught them about keeping a place clean after a fight. There was no prayer. Eli set a flat stone for weight. Clara stacked 2 more without being asked. Silas hobbled to his horse and didn't look back. Dutch lay groaning, hands open, blood thick where the mouth split. Eli took his knife and threw it into the creek so the current could tell its stories on the way to other towns. "Go," he said, and the single syllable did more work than a speech. Dutch went, eyes on the ground, as if it could still be persuaded. Clara's hands shook when she went to retie her scarf. She tied them still. Eli touched her wrist with the gentleness of someone handling a raw-backed colt. "Heavier than it looks," he said, meaning the little bone knife and all that came with it. She nodded and slid it back into its scabbard. The red cloth wet now and darker. They gathered what could be carried. A saddlebag lay split where Dutch had dropped it yesterday in the pass. Inside the oilskin, along with bent verses in a cramped hand, lay a thong threaded through a wolf tooth, worn smooth as old soap. The tooth had a mark cut into it, not letters so much as a habit. 2 G's nested like snakes, one blessing the other into wickedness. Clara held it between finger and thumb. The pitch-black lines bit a little. The pines kept their winter talk. Somewhere up the draw, a jay laughed like a boy who'd learned the wrong joke. "Gideon Goss," Eli said. He didn't put a shape on the name beyond the one it already had. They started back along the low side of the creek, leaving less behind than they took, which is all a person can ask of a day like this. The wind shifted and came soft off. The springs, smelling faintly of mineral and smoke and bread. Clara felt the weight of the wolf tooth cool in her pocket, and for the first time since High Lonesome, she let a thought cross the threshold and sit. Not safety, not yet, only the fact of choice. They had turned toward staying when they could have run. The country noticed, the country always does. They saw it first in the sky, not on the ground. A loose circle of buzzards turning above the far bend where the Brazos throws its elbow, black coins against a pale noon. They didn't drift like scavengers lazy on a warm column. They held to a wheel counting something. Soledad watched a long time with her hands still. "No corer," she said, and the word went farther than the springs. "Don't run. Make them come where you choose." Eli shook ash out of last night's fire and filled a tow sack. He walked 50 paces downwind and dragged it behind him, laying a pale thread that would look like a camp, moved too quick by scared people. He scuffed prints wide where a single man could read 3. At the edge of a wash, he struck a match and fed 2 pinches of ash to the flame. A stingy smoke crawled up, the kind a greenhorn builds. Then he circled back on stone and left nothing for a tracker to drink but bad guesses. Clara wrapped June and Jessie tight, one high, one low, so their breaths wouldn't fight for the same air. She laid an extra strip of flannel at each mouth for warmth and quiet, then pulled her coat flat over everything and bound it with a scarf. The babies went soft and heavy, the way a person trusts a hammock. She took the bone knife because it asked little and gave enough. They slid into a slit of sandstone where the world narrowed to a shoulder's width. A slot canyon keeps secrets the way a hymn keeps a tune, old, low, and sure. The walls wore water's handwriting from 1,000 floods. Eli checked the roof with his palm like a man feeling the heat in a branding iron and nodded. Out front, he set one more can and thong rattle under a skim of dust. If a boot brushed it, the stones would tattle. From the mouth, they could see a page of the country. Juniper pushed flat by wind, a line of ant mounds. The distant glitter where water tried to look harmless. They didn't build a fire. They sat with the heat they had. Soledad took a pinch of copal and did not light it. She pressed it to Clara's wrist instead, a clean smell to tell the blood to move. The sound came first, long before dust, a small horn mournful and proud. One note held just past comfort. Then the riders, 6, then 9, stringing along in pairs, eyes sharp, mouths mean for sport. Their hats rode low, their coats hung stiff with pitch, and the tar brand sat on their gear like it had grown there. The man in the middle wore no color at all. Even his horse looked like a shadow with weight. He raised the horn and let another note float. Gideon Goss preaching to saddles. They found Eli's ash line and followed it like a sermon they already believed. Twice they fanned, then gathered again when the pretend trail threaded into broken stone. One rider swung off and fingered the dust, smug as a cat at cream. Eli watched his hand slide right past the tell of a second path cut above boot height, a little shine where a man's coat had brushed the rock going the other way. Wind held its breath. The horn sounded once more, and Goss turned his horse west, away from the slit, toward the wash Eli wanted them to want. The rest slicked in after like beads on a string. Jesse coughed then, a sharp bark he couldn't keep. Sound hit the stone and came back double. Clara pressed him to her breast and counted with her ribs. 4 in, 6 held, 8 out, till his small lungs remembered patience. June's fist opened, closed, opened again, feeling for a rhythm she could borrow. Eli set his palm on Clara's knee and let the quiet of his body lean into hers, a stillness that bled steadiness. They waded through another measure of horn and hoof. Dust smeared the horizon where the wash ran crooked towards the Badlands. The last rider in line turned in his saddle and looked behind him as if he'd left a door open. The canyon held its breath and then exhaled through a narrow crack like a flute playing to itself. The man shrugged and kicked on. Soledad rose without hurry. She took the tow sack with the last of the ash and slung it over her shoulder like laundry. "I go," she said, not asking permission a second time. "Give them a shadow to chase." Clara shook her head before the word, knew it had weight, but the old woman had already set her course. She tucked her braid inside her shawl, smeared a thumbful of pitch across her cheek, and stepped out into the light, small as a quail and twice as hard to shoot. She walked straight into the wind so her scent would ride where she wanted it, heels careful, toes sure. In a dozen steps she wasn't a woman, she was a rumor. The horn blew once more, shorter, and the wheel of riders pinched and then stretched, part of it bending to the west where Soledad's ash line began again, the rest pulling lazy circles, listening for fear. Goss stood in his stirrups and lifted his chin, as if some scripture only he could hear had turned a page. Eli waited till the dust line pulled like taffy between two horizons and then touched Clara's shoulder. "Not yet," he breathed, which was the same as saying soon. June slept with her mouth open like a small O. Jesse's breath warmed the flannel. The slot canyon kept their heat and their hope, and gave no hint of either to the country outside. The buzzards loosened their circle and drifted a little north, interested, like old men at a new story. The horn fell silent. Wind came back to itself and combed the tops of the juniper. Somewhere beyond sight, Soledad's ash made a pale road into the bad ground, and the Brotherhood rode it as if it were theirs by right and not by trick. Clara did not pray. She counted, heartbeats, breaths, the small weight of 2 lives, the larger weight of one woman walking into danger with her chin up and her eyes soft. When she reached the end of numbers that helped, she began again at 1. The river had come up mean, fat with melt and the memory of mountains. It shouldered banks and rolled drift like bones. Brazos Bend made a slow elbow through cottonwoods with roots, like knuckles clenched in mud. The sound of it worked on the ribs, old talk, quick temper, They came to the crossing late afternoon, light thin as tin. No bridge. In spring, somebody always bragged they'd put one here, and summer always won the bet. What lay instead was a spruce that the last blow had thrown across at a narrow lick. Bark slick with moss, frost veined along it like a spider web. It wasn't a path, it was an argument. Eli set his hand to the trunk and felt it hum with water. One at a time, he said, because that was sense and because saying it out loud could make it truer. He showed Clara where to crawl low, belly square, knees turned in. He looped the rope around her waist and twice around a stub of root, and gave it back to her so she could feel the knot hold. June went high against Clara's collarbone, face to cheek, breath a warm coin. Jesse rode low, swaddled tight, his small weight part of her now the way a heartbeat is part of a man who's made promises. She set her palms flat and went out over the rush. The cold leapt at her through the bark. The river threw wet against her eyelashes till the world was only green and gray, and the roar under her like a beast trapped in a cave. Halfway she slid just a hand's breadth, and lay down hard, chest to wood, the twins gone still with her. The rope took up what her legs dropped. She breathed in numbers until numbers found their feet again. She set her fingers deeper into the furrows and moved. On the far side, she rolled to her back in the needles and let the sky arrive. June mewed once like a cat, a sound better than any hymn. Jesse huffed and settled. Across the water, Eli had the hatchet in his belt now, Jesse's sling ready, and his face that quiet a man wears when he owes the day more than he has. He came out on the log slow, knees wide, one hand on the rope, one on the bark, his breath regular because breath is something a body can be taught to mind. A shot cracked up the bend and shaved a chip from the trunk near his hip, a white spit into the dark. He didn't look back. He slid the child across into Clara's hands, one clean pass, the weight of a human future measured in a second, and then he was light enough to move quick. "Go," Clara said, not loud. He went to his knees on their bank and pulled the hatchet free. Riders topped the rise, a string of coats pitched with tar, horses throwing heads at the scent of river. The first wet bullets of spray hit them when the wind shifted. Eli set his boot on the butt of the trunk and swung. Once, twice. The blade bit and sang. The log shivered and did not agree. A round found bark by his ear and screamed into the timber behind. He swung again, a sound more grunt than word. The trunk cracked with a steady, reluctant sound, like an old oath getting broken in half. Another swing and the spruce tore loose of itself, turned, and let go. The river took it as if it had been waiting to all along. Water surged up, slapped his legs, tried to own him. He stumbled back, hatchet still in his grip, and the cold bit him to the bone. Something hot traced a line along his shoulder. Graze or burn, he didn't check. He came on hands and knees and then to feet, and Clara pulled him the last arm's length into the brush, rope biting her palm, raw and true. The riders threw curses and lead at the gap the river had made. Two horses tested a leap and changed their minds all at once. Spray leapt up and took a hat, carried it down like a joke. One man knelt and snugged his rifle in the crook of a root and shot at sound, not sight. The water slapped his bullet sideways as if it had authority. They ran the timber no more than a dozen strides, to where the ground turned soft and old needles held quiet. Eli's breath came harsh and then leveled. Clara wrapped his shoulder tight with a strip she tore from the inside of her skirt, hands working while her eyes watched the bend. The twins settled into the rhythm of two chests close. The country went back to pretending it was empty. "Time," Eli said, not believing in the larger word that sat behind it. He picked up the hatchet and slid it home. They moved along a deer path that wore the look of a thought you could trust, winding, sure of water, humble about distance. Behind them, men shouted at a river that had no ears for them. At the far edge of sight, where the trees made a comb against the sky, a black coat sat a black horse and did not hurry. The man raised no rifle. He only watched with a thin line for a mouth, considering how Scripture might fit this new hole in his plan. The horse dipped its head. The man, Gideon Goss, smiled like a door closing soft. The trees thinned to open ground where wind had learned some manners. Larkspur Hollow wasn't a town so much as a holding of stubborn, half a windbreak of cedar rails, two cabins leaning into each other for courage, a scatter of tarp roofs stitched from wagon canvas, and faith. A smith's anvil sat under a lean-to like a sleeping bull. Smoke rose thin and blue, not enough to brag. They came in slow, Eli walking the horses, Clara with June tucked high, and Jessie riding low. A woman with a needle stuck in her sleeve stepped from a doorway, thread trailing like a kite string. She had a square jaw and a mouth set for getting on with it. "Hattie Boone," she said, and wiped her hands on her apron to show there was no harm in them. "That your man's shoulder needs a look." She didn't wait for permission, only clicked her tongue at Clara the way a midwife clicks at a mare. "And those babies need heat that doesn't come borrowed." From the anvil shade a rangy fellow rose, shirt scorched at the cuffs, eyes the gray of horseshoes. "Luke Sparrow," he said, as if the name were a tool he trusted. He took the reins and walked the horse to water that had the decency to hold still. A third figure, a narrow priest in a coat polished by years, lifted a hand in blessing without raising his voice about it. "Hoyt," he said, the collar worn thin but clean. The hollow took them the way dry ground takes rain. Hattie had a pot boiling before Clara could set her bundle down. Clara made a kitchen of an upturned crate, stripped a handful of corn from a cob, and found her hands remembering what they'd done before grief bent them. Chop, stir, taste, add a pinch of salt from the bottom of somebody else's tin. Jessie woke to the smell and made a face like an old ranch boss not pleased with the cook, and then, remembering himself, smiled. June laughed first, one sharp note like a flint strike. The sound chased a chill from the canvas and made Hattie turn her head quick as if she'd heard her name. Eli stood under the lean-to while Luke dabbed whiskey on the grays and wrapped his shoulder with a strip of clean muslin torn from an old wedding shirt somebody had kept for luck and finally found its use. The anvil kept a low company hum as Luke set 3 light taps into a bent nail until it agreed to be straight again. "Nails'll lie to you if you let 'em," he said. "Treat 'em kind, they'll take a roof." They ate out of the same pot. Clara dipped for Hattie first, then Luke, then Father Hoyt, saving the bottom, where the sweet bits settle, for last and for the babies. No one made a speech. The coffee pot, dented, loyal, ticked by the coals like a clock, keeping church time. Night gathered at the rim of the hollow and looked in. Luke fetched water from the well with a rope bucket that knew 100 hands. When he poured it to cool the steel, a sour sheen slicked across the quench and threw a rainbow where no rainbow belonged. He sniffed and swore under his breath, the way a careful man swears when something sacred's been touched. Eli dipped a finger and rubbed it clean on his jeans. Kerosene, sure as hard winter. They went to the well and leaned over. The rope came up shining. The stones smelled like a lamp turned over. Hoyt's mouth flattened. Hattie's needle froze halfway to the cloth. "Someone's been busy," she said, and the words had edges. Eli lit a sliver of rag on a stick and lowered it. The flame flinched, guttered, kept a stubborn blue. "Can't drink it," he said. "Can't cook with it, can't bathe a child in it. Not till the creek's taught a new trick." "We make do," Hattie answered, not as a brave thing, but a daily one. She rolled her sleeves and started hauling bucket after bucket to throw what was fouled onto ground that might forgive. They worked in a hush that had no self-pity in it. Clara kept the children close and built a soup thicker than the water deserved. using what women have always used to scold hunger, her own patience. She set 2 tin bowls aside, one for any stranger who came empty, one for late calling law or luck. When the moon put a nickel edge on the windbreak, Eli walked the line where canvas met dirt. Something had been busy under the main tarp, a few shavings too new, a scuff where a boot had dragged, a piece of pine pitch rolled to a black shine with a thumb. He lifted the tarp's edge and saw the mark cut into the joist with a knife that had learned the habit. A triangle inside fire lines. Pine brand had been under their roof while they boiled coffee and made soup and laughed about nothing at all. He let the edge down and stood still long enough to hear his own breath. The babies were asleep. June with one hand thrown up like she'd just remembered a song. Jesse with his mouth open, dreaming of milk or horses or the moon. Addie snored, delicate, surprised at herself each time. Hoyt wrote a line in a notebook by firelight and blew the page cool. On the big oak at the hollow's edge, something white moved where no leaf belonged. Eli walked to it and found a paper cut from different hands, letters cobbled from newspapers and store bills, pasted straight with pitch. Give the widow back. He held it a long moment the way a man holds a snake to learn what it knows. Then he folded it once, twice, and slid it into his coat. He went back to the fire and poured the coffee that had sat too long and tasted wrong but still warmed. He looked at Clara across the glow. She met him, steady, her face lit from below, the baby's 2 small hills rising and falling at her ribs. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. The country had taken its measure and left them theirs. Build water, old ground, expect company. Morning came on with a stiff back and a plan. The well was a dead mouth they couldn't use. That left the side creek laid thin through willow and stone above the hollow. Eli and Luke walked the slope with a string and a pocket level Luke had sweated over in his shop, a bubble in a glass tube soldered to a brass plate, the kind of tool a man builds because no store will carry what he needs when he needs it. They marked grade with charcoal on cottonwood, picked a line that would fall without hurrying, and set to work. The flume was born ugly, short boards salvaged from wagon sides, juniper poles cut to length, chinks daubed with moss and clay. Haiti boiled beeswax and tallowed the seams with a spoon meant for sugar. Clara's hands, bound in Soledad's neat muslin, bled through anyway, and she didn't stop. Women dragged rags through the ditch and tamped them with boot heels. Father Hoyt hauled rock to a low weir, the collar dark with sweat, his breath a prayer he didn't say aloud. Children fetched fist stones and learned the trade of staying. By noon, they turned the creek with a shovel's blunt logic. Water nosed into the weir, rose, considered, and took the new path. The first trickle found every lie in their work. It leaked from a seam, ran under a stave, trembled at a corner joint, and tried to go home. They chased it with handfuls of clay, with moss pounded soft, with strips of linen pressed into cracks like scripture placed under a door. A shot coughed from the rim above the cottonwoods and threw dust off the anvil. Another whined across the windbreak and clipped a cedar thin as a finger. The brotherhood was up there, plinking at distance for spite. Eli didn't lift the Winchester. He walked the flume, palm flat, as if quiet could travel through wood. Luke kept to his heels with a mallet and a mouth set hard enough to throw sparks. Clara felt heat rise in June before she saw it, a shine on the child's lip, breath going fast, eyes failing to focus on anything that wasn't her. She carried the girl to a tin wash basin, poured in creek sweet water, and laid 2 small stones in the coals till they sang, then slipped them under the rim to warm the bath to what a fever will accept. She crushed Sheriff Doolin's willow powder between finger and thumb and let it melt on June's tongue, then set skin to skin, cheek to crown, counting the way Soledad had taught, 4 in, 6 held, 8 out, till the heat eased its fist. Jesse patted the basin's rim, solemn as a judge, and made a new sound just to prove he could. Up on the rim, a rider leaned into his sights and learned nothing but the shape of his own meanness. Eli walked past Hattie and touched 2 fingers to the crosspin he'd set in the spillgate, rawhide over a wedge, a poor man's valve. Father Hoyt nodded once. Luke's mallet stilled. When the head behind the brush dam took a hard breath and the flume planks stopped trembling, Eli pulled the pin. Water shouldered out of the gate in a flat sheet that gathered speed like a horse pointed home. It hit the cut bank below the rim and leapt, a cold hand that slapped the slope slick. The first 2 horses lost their feet all at once, the way a lie does when a fact shows up. Men cursed and windmilled and went down in a tangle of limbs and iron that hurt pride more than bone. Another tried to force through and met a surge that had opinions. He changed his mind mid-stride and he let the hill have him. The hollow didn't cheer. Folks here saved noise for work. Hattie kept feeding the fire. Luke trotted the line for leaks. Eli shoved the wedge back in before the creek decided to take the whole ridge. One man in a pitch-stained coat slid too far and wrapped himself in a snare wire someone had set for coyotes, back when trouble had a different name. He came up hissing, not from pain but from the surprise of being the small animal for once. They dragged him in, pinned his wrists with a strip of harness, and gave him air enough to keep a conscience awake. Evening set its hand on the hollow gentle as rain. Water from the flume ran into a barrel through a bit of clean sacking, and the first dipper came up clear enough to see the bottom. Hattie took it and drank, the hard tilt of her neck breaking into something soft she'd misplaced years ago. Luke swallowed and stared at his boots like a man embarrassed by mercy. Father Hoyt wet his lips and crossed himself, then anyone else within reach. Eli poured the last into the coffee pot. The old tin clicked and the smell rose honest, not carrying the ghost of oil. Clara bathed June again and watched the fever step back. Jesse fell asleep with his hand in the water, fingers open as if receiving change. She lifted her gaze and the whole hollow looked different by the width of a cup of clean. The man in the pitchcoat stared at nothing. His tarred hat lay on the dirt like a dead thought. No one asked him for words. You can't force water uphill. After a long while, he turned his head toward the twins and spoke with a throat scoured raw by dust and pride. He wants the twins for the right, he whispered. The coffee pot ticked once and went quiet. The creek kept on talking like it didn't know what a man had just said. They tied the tar-coated man to the windbreak with a strip of harness and a knot that said nothing about mercy. He shut his eyes and kept his mouth open as if some last sentence would fall in if he waited. Hattie set a tin cup by his boot and went back to the boil. Luke stood with his hands on the anvil like he might pick it up and carry it if the hollow asked. Clara lifted June and Jesse to her shoulder and let the words sit where they landed. He wants the twins for the right. The thought had a shape and no furniture. She pressed her cheek to warm hair that smelled of smoke and soap and the creek's new honesty. Eli met her look and let it pass through him like a nail through green wood. We don't run, he said. Oh, not big, she nodded once. We make the ground tell them no. The day moved in work clothes. Luke dragged out 2 old kerosene cans Pine Brand had left near the well, their seams sticky with the same pitch that marked the joist. Waste cuts both ways, he said, and rolled them to the far edge of the windbreak, where the ground dipped toward a stand of cedar the riders had piled as tinder for somebody else's house. Eli laid a trench with a mattocks from the smithy, shallow and true, then a second past the pig pen, a third just beyond the priest's lean-to. They filled the channels with sand, laid straw thin as hair, and drizzled what the cans would give, lines as fine as pencil marks. Hattie strung wire low at knee-height, between two posts, and tied a bell from a broken harness where the wind wouldn't find it. Children hauled brush that looked like brush. Clara tamped dirt over a row of sharpened stakes below a drift of leaves by the oak. Evening put blue under everything. Father Hoyt read a single verse and closed the book, the cover worn smooth at the corners by people who had gripped it like rope. He blessed the babies without asking and handed Hattie a rag that had once been a collar. She folded it twice and set it in her apron the way a woman sets aside a letter she plans to keep. Wind cooled and then quit. Owls took their watch. The tied man began to hum a flat bar of tune that might have been a lullaby once before someone dipped it in tar. Hattie glanced over and the hum stopped. They killed the fires and let the hollow breathe dark. Eli walked the line and laid his hand to each pin and gate like a shepherd tapping a fence. Luke went after him with a hammer held by the neck, not the head. Clara set the twins deep under the table where the coffee pot would have sat. If this were a better night, 3 quilts over, 1 quilt under, a stone warmed and wrapped near their feet the way Soledad had taught. She kissed their foreheads and stood back up, with her hands empty and her mouth set. The first man through the cedars never knew the wire until it sang. His knee hit dirt and his hand hit the bell, and the bell called the hollow to attention. Another one slipped into the shallow trench and took mesquite thorns through his palms. The hiss that came out of him died in his teeth when he felt how close his face was to the stake points under the leaves. Shots came careless at first, men shooting at dark like it owed them a face. The windbreak held. The canvas roofs shook and kept their own names. Eli struck a match cupped in both hands and set the thinnest line to whisper. Fire crawled the sand like a smart snake that knows its way home. It reached the cedar, slash the riders had stacked and remembered what it was made for. Flame rose quick and bright where Pine Brand had planned it for someone else, and the light pulled men toward it like vanity. Eli's second line took on then, a pale thread licking along the pig pen's far edge until it crossed itself at the little sump Luke had dug, and the whole thing turned into a sheet that pushed heat outward, a wall a horse wouldn't test, and a man would lie about later. They tried to rush the low side through smoke. Hattie saw the shape first, the pitchcoat, the gun hand, the angle that meant someone had learned the hollow's habits. She shoved Clara sideways and took the ball through the meat of her upper arm. She didn't scream. She sat down hard and put her teeth on a folded strip of collar, while blood found her apron and went to work darkening it. Clara was on her in the same breath, dragging her by the belt behind the smithy post, smoke painting them both with the same soot. Luke crawled on his knuckles with a needle-nose plier and bit the lead out like a man pulling a nail from old oak, one steady twist, no drama. Hold. Hattie held. Out beyond the cedar flare, a ridge of tar coats showed, and then broke apart in confusion when the heat said no. One pitched forward into Clara's stake bed and learned about the wages of planning evil. Another fell to his knees and started to pray to the ground as if it would change its mind. Eli fired once, not to kill, only to send one head down and the rest with it. The man who'd fired on Hattie surfaced at the edge of the light, eyes black as the tar in his hat brim, mouth shaping a scripture he'd bent to fit his wish. Clara saw the angle, felt the pull, and didn't wait. She threw the coffee kettle, empty but iron still has a say, caught his wrist, and turned the gun into dirt. He stumbled into the shallow trench, and the wire found his ankle, and the bell called it done. Silence took a long taste then. Smoke folded into itself and lay down. The cedar fire sank to a reddened grin. A wounded man moaned at the edge of the windbreak, and then shut up when Luke showed him the cut of his own shadow with a raised hammer. The kerosene lines fizzed out where they were meant to. Stars returned one by one like shy cattle. Hattie breathed through her teeth while Father Hoyt threaded black through skin with a fishbone needle and a hand that had signed too many papers under worse lights. Clara held the lantern low and watched the thread make a new road. Eli stood above, eyes on the rim, counting heads that didn't show. "They'll try another door," he said, and the words didn't need a reply. When the hollow had its quiet back, they took stock without talking. 2 horses gone to smoke, 1 canvas roof scorched, patched with a wet sack, a broken bell, a bent nail straightened, a woman who'd given blood back to the earth and taken the needle like it was Sunday bread. The tar man tied to the windbreak had sweated pitch through his hatband. He stared at the twins' quilt and pretended not to. Clara went to look for Father Hoyt's book, to put it back where he liked it. The crate he used for a lectern sat open. The book lay closed and cool. The priest's coat hung on its nail. His hat was gone. On the oak, just above the place where Eli had pulled the pasted paper, a cloth square flapped in a small wind. The priest's white collar, scored with a thumb smear of pine tar in the shape of a crooked cross. The bell, broken though it was, seemed to remember its job and gave one tired tick in the dark. They reached the cedar stand before dawn, where trunks grew tight and straight till the sky narrowed to a nave. Wind moved high like choir breath. Pitch bled at old cuts and glass to black beads. Someone had been at work. Rings of stones, stubs of candles, a rude altar from split rails. Beyond, the ground dropped to a bowl where floodwater had printed 1,000 swirls and gone away. A place made to take sound and give it back. Father Hoyt knelt with his hands bound to a sapling, head tipped like he was listening for his own pulse. Tar striped the bark beside him in a crooked cross. Men in pitch-dark coats lounged on the rim, guns easy, eyes hungry. At the center, horse-tied, black coat uncreased, Gideon Goss tuned a horn with the care a lyre gives his voice. He lifted his chin to the east, as if he could summon dawn and witness at once. Before midnight, Eli and Luke had walked the side draws above the bowl and set poor man's gates where spring seep fed a trickle even in hard years. Stones pried, brush woven, wedges cut from cedar hearts. It wasn't much. It was enough if luck remembered their names. Now Luke lay up canyon with a hand on the first wedge. Eli touched his own, farther west. Clara stood in the trees where Goss could see her when she chose and not a breath before. The horn gave one low bar that made the cedars vibrate. Goss spoke into the bowl like a man who loved the shape his words made. He talked about fear dressed as order and blood dressed as proof. He lifted the collar he'd taken and held it up like a fishing trophy. Men chuckled in their throats. Clara stepped out. She came plain, coat buttoned, hair tied back, a child's shawl at her throat because it was what she had. No bravado. She let the quiet do the walking. Half the heads turned. Goss smiled without warmth. "Widow," he said. The word rolled in his mouth to make it taste like victory. "You brought my sermon its sign." Clara didn't answer. She dropped the wolf-tooth thong into the dust between them, that little circle of sin rolling once and dying. Goss's smile held, but his eyes flicked. She took one more step and let him believe she'd come to bargain, an old trick, older than guns. Behind him, Eli slid along cedar shadow toward the sapling where Hoyt knelt, knife at his palm like a splinter of moon. Up on the lips of the draws, 2 men waited with their hands on 2 small choices of water. "You think men will stay if you're spared," Goss said. "You think they won't if you are not." "I trade in certainties." He lifted his hand, and 2 rifles rose to match. Clara let him see her gaze move over the candles, the tar smudges, the bowl where the ground took a curve like a saucer. She set her heel on the line Eli had scratched at dawn, no more than a scuff, and felt the grayed tip under cedar duff. She gave one small nod at the trees, as if to answer someone only she could hear. Luke pulled his wedge. A thin sheet rolled silent down the first draw, a veil no thicker than a hand. Eli pulled his. The second sheet met the first, two hands clasping. Water found the bowl, read the old swirls, and remembered its work. Candles hissed and went out like lies under witness. Tar flared once and died wet. Men forgot scripture and remembered balance. Horses fought rope. A rifle cracked too high. Another shot hit mud and said almost. Eli reached Hoyt and cut once, twice. The sapling let go. The priest fell forward into Eli's shoulder and came back to his feet with the stubborn of a man who had chosen his vocation in drought, not flood. "Go," Eli breathed, and the priest went where the cedars grew thick and honest. Goss stood in water to his boot tops, black coat soaking, trying to decide if pride could swim. Clara stayed where the scuff line told her, where stones set at dawn raised the ground, a finger's width higher than the bowl. The flood ran past her ankles, cold as judgment. A man lunged out of the dark at her and hit the old snare Luke had set low. Wire found him at the shin and turned him awkward. Eli didn't shoot him in the back. He didn't need to. Fear did the subtracting. Goss came forward 2 steps, horn in one hand because he couldn't let it go. He reached for Clara like a pastor reaching for a soul he means to own. She didn't back away. She slid a cedar knot with a thong around his wrist and gave the thong one tug, and the knot drew tight the way cedar hearts do when asked. He jerked and found the other end buried in a root that has known wind for 50 winters. She stepped aside. The flood took his knees. He went down slow, not drowning, nothing so clean, just losing shape under mud and hurry. Eli hauled 2 men out by the collars when the water caught them wrong, then shoved them toward trees and life. Another threw down his gun and crawled. The rest let the bowl make them small. When the rush thinned to a sheet, the place went wholly quiet. A jay called once and shut up. They didn't beat Goss. They unmade his room. He lay there gasping, coat a new color, horn gone, tar washed to a bruise. Eli cut the cedar thong from the root and looped it twice around the preacher's wrists by the knot that would travel. He didn't strike him. He didn't raise his voice. He tugged once and started walking. They met Sheriff Doolin at the ford below, where flood slackens to think. He had found the black strand of smoke the night before and ridden the ridge till the ground got honest about where men would be this morning. He took the thong, set it to his saddle ring, and didn't do more than spit and nod. "Dry Creek's still got a cell," he said, "and a door that shuts." Clara stood with water at her boots and let her breath get the message. Luke came down grinning and ruined it by looking shy. Father Hoyt sat a long time on a stone and stared at his hands like he was counting news. Above, the cedars wept a little pitch, as they always do. Men who could still walk drifted off, smaller than their coats. None were shot in the back. The bowl cooled. Candle stubs lay like teeth. Clara picked up the wolf tooth and walked it to the rim, set it in a fork of cedar high where children couldn't find it and crows would. She wiped mud from her palms on her skirt and didn't look at Goss again. Rumor travels fast where wind has practice. By noon it was out in the flats. Pine brand broke like a bad board, some splinters in the brush, some carried off by water, some pocketed by men not ready to admit the tool failed. The hollow would hear all shapes of the story by night. Eli lifted the coffee pot from Luke's fire and set it to tick on a flat rock. When it boiled soft, he poured a cup and handed it to Clara. Steam touched her face. She held the heat with both hands and let the country feel her choose. The story didn't end at the cedar bowl. It settled its weight in Larkspur Hollow, where wind forgot its temper and the creek learned a steady tune. Days got their backs into work. Nights remembered mercy. Somewhere down canyon, Sheriff Doolin shut a door on a black coat and set his boot against it. Rumor ran its traps and came home with different pelts. Some said the river ate a preacher. Some said a preacher learned to drink plain water. Either way, he wasn't here. They rebuilt as if they'd been waiting their whole lives to start. Luke set a fresh ridgepole and talked to nails till they believed again. Hattie, pale but cussed, picked stitches one by one and tied knots. Only a storm could second-guess. Father Hoyt wore a sling he refused to mention and read grace over coffee that no longer carried the ghost of oil. Soledad came up from the warm springs with a coil of red thread and a bag of medicine stones. She left both without ceremony and patted Jessie's calf like she was blessing a colt. The flume learned to sing, first thin, then true. Moss took hold in the seams where care had pressed it and made a green alphabet there. Strokes the creek could read from bank to barrel. The spill gate whispered open mornings, afternoons it sighed shut. Water filled a trough Hattie scrubbed with lye till it squeaked. You could see your face in it on good days, and on bad days you could still see sky. June found her feet on the porch boards and made a map of them with heel marks. She laughed at every step like the earth was a new joke told only to her. Jessie banged a square nail on an old harmonica tin until the tin told him to show some respect. Then he tapped gentler and learned the sound of patience. In the sun between chores, Soledad tied the red thread high on the door lintel and said nothing. Folks glanced up at it and felt their shoulders stop riding so high. Ely took to mending anything that would hold still long enough. Bridles, a busted chair rung, a child's shoe, soul laid wrong by hard play. Sometimes he'd stand under the windbreak at dusk and look out where mesquite drew itself ragged against a low sky. His shoulder kept its opinion when weather changed, and he let it. A scar is a stitch the day put in. You don't pick it out just because the shirt's mended. Clara boiled coffee in the dented pot and learned the names of quiet. She wiped the table twice, when once would do. She hung the twins' shirts on a line where they could snag all the honest light, then brought them in warm and pressed her face to cotton like a woman who knows what can vanish. She mended small sock heels, a thin place in a blanket, the thought that peace is only something you hear about. When the babies slept, she set a new hem in a bit of flour sack and turned it into something that could carry bread. Work is how you talk to tomorrow without interrupting it. Evenings ran long and soft. Luke's anvil gave 4 slow notes as he straightened a bent hinge. Hattie's needle winked in lamplight like a polite star. Father Hoyt traced a cross in ash and wiped it away with his thumb so folks wouldn't have to wear it all night. Doolin rode up twice, left news, and took none he didn't need. He sat the second time with his hat in his hands like a boy, visiting company, drank coffee like it had saved his life, and rode off easier in the saddle than he'd come. They didn't speak of leaving. They stacked firewood tight. They kept a second water barrel lidded. They made room in their pockets for both luck and rain. When a far shot cracked on a Sunday, it turned out to be a ranch hand shooting at a tin on a stump, the kind of foolish a man does when he forgets winter. Folks lifted their heads, listened once, and let the day go back to its loafing. Some pieces of the old fear kept their roosts. June sometimes woke, eyes wide at nothing, and settled when the coffee pot ticked like a clock she trusted. Jessie startled at coyote yips until he learned coyotes were only poverty with fur and a good voice. Every so often Clara felt the country lean and remembered snow over her in a white ravine. The memory walked through her polite and sat by the door, and she let it. Soledad had told her to remember forward. She did. The day the flume froze thin and then thought better of it. Eli planed the window frame clean and set its glass to looking outward. Mesquite, a smear of wind, a hawk written small. He shaved a sliver from the stile, and it fit, a right thing done. Inside, Hattie tucked her healed arm into a woven sling, only when it ached, and June stuffed a rag doll with cedar shavings so it would smell like courage. Jesse discovered how to hand a tool to a man so the handle met the palm, not the blade, one of the smaller pieces of civilization. Morning came plain, a tin sky turning milk by the minute. Coffee whispered on the boil. The flume sang a long note as the gate eased. Clara lifted both children and stepped into the doorway where light found them honest. She set their feet on the board step, placed her boots side by side where mud had dried into the cracks and didn't matter anymore, and held the warm cups of their skulls in her palms like prayer bowls. She watched steam lift off the coffee mug and make a small ghost in the air that didn't frighten anybody. She didn't raise her voice. A sky this size doesn't need proving. She looked out at country that keeps both trouble and mercy in the same drawer and spoke the only vow she owed it. I will not leave. If this story touched you, drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments. I'll know you're riding with us. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next tale from the Wild West waiting just down the trail.